All right, good morning, everyone. Sorry for the late start. We're waiting on one more of our panelists to join us. Hopefully he'll be able to make it. If not, we may have one of the other Carlisle scholars jump up and speak in his place, but you know how it is with rain in Washington. It's like everything kind of comes to a grinding halt. But on that note, thank you all for coming out this rainy Friday morning to join us for this important conversation on Army structural reform. The conversation about structural reform has been in the public conversation a lot at a defense-wide level. Of course, just last month, Ashton Carter came out with his proposed reforms to improve the Pentagon's performance and ability to better address threats. A lot of this has to do, they're calling it, Congress is doing it as well, of course, they're calling it Goldwater-Nichols 2.0. It's been about 30 years, in fact, a little bit past 30 years, since Goldwater-Nichols 1.0 was passed, which of course was something that really kind of brought jointness into the mindset of the military, and that encouraged people to work together more closely, and came up with a lot of different reforms based on things that had happened in disasters like Desert One. So this is long overdue. Obviously, a lot has changed since 1986, but the conversation we want to have today is not so much focused on the military as a whole as it is how do some of these reforms, not only the ones that Carter and McCain have talked about, but what are some of the reforms that the Army could actually do to change its structure? I think arguably the Army maybe has the biggest challenge to face in terms of changes to the threat environment since the 1980s. So I was really excited to hear that the Carlisle scholars were talking about this issue and that they wanted to have this event today. Because we don't have too much time, I think I'll just jump right into comments. We have some great panelists today. We'll start out with Colonel Kevin McAninch from the War College, who will talk a little bit about some of the work that the Carlisle scholars have been doing on this topic, and the paper that just recently came out, which I think is available on War on the Rocks now. And then we'll jump into comments on some of those on the paper that's come out from Philip Carter from Center for New American Security, and then we also have Lieutenant Colonel Eric Weiss from the National Defense University here as well. I'll have a few questions then, and then we'll open it up to audience questions. I want to make sure that all of you have time to kind of nitpick this very interesting issue. So with that, Colonel McAninch.
Thank you so much. First, I appreciate y'all being here. It's an honor for us to come here and talk about the issues in the Army. It's obviously something that we are personally invested in, and so your interest is appreciated. Our work this year in the Carlisle Scholars Program at the War College started with the idea that we could mirror the National Commission on the Future of the Army's look into the Army. We had the same problem statement, the same scope, the same ideas to do the research, just not the same authorities and not the same budget. So we quickly learned as 17 students in an academic environment that we were taking on a problem that was probably this big, but we only had the resources and the time to do something a little bit smaller. That said, we felt as we went through the process that our ability to say something that could be of value to the Army and to those in the defense industry looking at the Army of the future would be valuable. So what I'll briefly do is just describe sort of our main sections of the report and what we looked at in addition to our process, and then I can do a little deep dive into the Army command structure chapter, which I was the principal author for and researcher on, as we looked at the 8 layers of command in the Army and are we structured right. The first thing we did in the process was take a look at the strategic environment that exists in the world. We didn't, quite honestly, have the intellectual capacity and futures look to go out, to 2030, 2040, like some of the folks in the building may be doing. So we kind of took a 10-year look at what's occurring now and where we thought it may go, and it led us to the conclusion, that there's 4 requirements for the United States Army. First is to defeat and deter adversaries. Second is to operate in gray spaces and sort of the places between peace and between war in the world. The third was to be involved in building partner capacity with nations throughout the world. And the fourth was to contribute to stability operations, which is, I know, sometimes a taboo topic. Those four requirements then fed into the next section of our analysis, where we looked at all the things that the United States Army is told to do. A lot of times folks center around the fact that, the Army is about brigade combat teams, and I know that's how we're counted in terms of budget and personnel and end strength, but the Army is much more than our 30 active brigade combat teams and 26 National Guard and Reserve brigade combat teams. There's 41 executive agency requirements that take up about 25% of our force structure. And sometimes that fact alone, that simple data point, is not known or understood. So the Army does a lot for the Department of Defense and the Joint Force writ large that sometimes we don't see or count. From the requirements section, our next step was to take a look at the culture of the Army. Obviously, if you're going to change an organization, you need to look at the culture and how it operates and the people that are in it. That for us was quite honestly a lot of fun, and where we got the most heated debate over who we are as an organization, who we are as senior leaders, who we are as soldiers, and the impacts that we can make and the things that we can do based on the culture that we have. And and I say can do because that's kind of the Army culture. Just give us a mission, we'll do it. Give us some resources and stay out of our way. It's sort of how we've all been brought up. When we got from that led us into the second part of the report, is where we got into our 3 recommendations, where we try to look at things we can do. The first talked about the joint interagency, intergovernmental, and multinational environments, and how we could be better as an Army to support that environment. We assessed that we do the joint piece pretty well, but the other part, the IIM part, we could do a lot better at, and it tied into our culture as well, and we can entertain some questions on that if you have some. Second recommendation dealt with agility, and I'm glad to see that my colleague Paul Larson was able to get here. He was the principal author and researcher of that, along with Dr. Andrew Hill. And it looked at what we have the components of the Army do to maybe better focus our training and our efforts, so we can be better utilized in the future and utilized more effectively. As we get smaller, which we know to be a reality, every soldier and every mission is going to count if we're going to meet national objectives. The third recommendation we had dealt with the command structure, and I'll briefly describe. We looked at all 8 levels of the command structure in the Army, and then principally focused in at the 3-star level Army Service Component Command and Corps Headquarters to figure out if we had the right folks in the right place and the right structure to be successful. So there's 6 geographic Army Service Component Commands that support our combatant commands, and then we have 3 corps. And what we tried to figure out is, are there personnel savings or functional consolidations or a different right leveling, meaning do we have the right grade structure and plate to outfit these organizations to be successful given the requirements? And then the last one was sort of a right layering thought process. Do we have the right number at that layer with the right operational effectiveness and capability to be successful given current requirements? We concluded that we did not, and that we had a recommendation for how it might be done in the future in terms of reinvigorating our Corps headquarters with more strength and assigning them, allocating them. That's an important word choice, allocating them to our combatant commanders. So we had a more operationally effective headquarters forward to support the joint fight. So that's a brief overview of what we did as an entire group. Phil is probably a little longer than you wanted me to go, but that's okay. I hope it's helpful, and I look forward to entertaining any questions that you may have. Thanks.
Thank you, Colonel McAninch. Colonel Larson, if you could maybe give a few minutes of comments, and in particular, if you could talk about your work on agility.
Okay. Yeah, good morning, everyone. As Kevin mentioned just briefly, I wrote about agility as the Army. Again, our report really focused on the Army internally. We saw our report as a self-help type of document. One of the get out of jail cards the Army has, that when it doesn't do well or when a war is not won, that it wasn't us, it wasn't the Army. In fact, it was just bad policy, or we didn't get the proper resources. So one important piece to this report is that we did not say that rather we are really focusing on what the Army can do to fix itself or to make it better. And really, we do this, and our backdrop is looking at the strategic environment, looking particularly over the past 15 years and the past 2 wars that the Army has really shouldered the burden for, and really acknowledging that the results of these 2 wars are, at best, in our mind, inconclusive, and that they are, at worst, a strategic disaster for the Army. So we use that as a starting point, and we also look to some of the results from the National Commission for the Future of the Army, in which they say that 980,000 soldiers together as the total Army, both the reserve and active component, is only minimally sufficient to meet the challenges of the future. So we understand that as we go forward together, that the integration between both the active component and the reserve component must remain tight, must remain similar to how it's been over the past 15 years, where we have served shoulder to shoulder together. So when we look at this concept of Army agility, in that the Army can accomplish any missions that it must in order to establish security conditions to achieve sustainable political outcomes, to fight and win our nation's wars, we are looking primarily at how we can accomplish some of the requirements. Now, Kevin mentioned the fact that we took a very careful look at the strategic environment, the requirements of the Army, as well as the Army's culture. And when we boiled it down to what the Army absolutely must do, we came up with 2 of its core missions as designated by the Army operating concept, which is combined arms maneuver on one end of the spectrum, the kind of high-intensity warfighting, and wide area security on the other end, which is more stability operations, consolidating gains, doing much of what we've seen in Afghanistan and Iraq over the past 15 years in terms of governance, development, reconstruction. We also came to the conclusion that the Army habitually has not been good at both simultaneously, that either we're good on one end of the spectrum or the other, but really haven't demonstrated a high level of proficiency in both at the same time. Our concern is that although the Army has lost some proficiency in the combined arms maneuver portion, that we are moving too quickly away from wide area security. And that when we look historically, not only in the past, over the past 60 years, and understand what the Army has done, it has largely been wide area security, and what the Army will do in the future, probably some more wide area security, that we think it's imperative that we maintain this. And we not just run back to the combined arms maneuver, because that's what Army culture really can drive us towards. So our proposal is that the components have to work together to accomplish the mission. We believe that for wide area security being a high priority mission, that the reserve component should prioritize that mission, should train on that. There's an inherent level of readiness that comes in the reserve component because they have civilian professions. And largely, the active component has leaned on the reserve component over the past 15 years. That's where you have things like city managers and engineers and farmers and all the people that perform civil tasks. And our proposal advocates for the National Guard, in particular, to prioritize this. Now, what we are not advocating is that they lose the ability to conduct combined arms maneuver, or that they change their units, or a structure, a force structure change. We say that they specialize in that, while the reserve component specialize more, prioritize more combined arms maneuver, so that if we have to go to war tonight, we have a force that can respond. And we believe that allocating missions along these lines will allow the Army to truly be agile, so that if we go to war again, such as in Iraq, we don't lose 3 or 4 years figuring out how to do stability operations, how to do counterinsurgency, and in fact, how to do wide area security. In fact, we have a component that's trained, manned, equipped, and ready to go immediately. And And this is an interesting, has been controversial a lot of places that we've briefed, but I look forward to discussing this further. Thanks.
Thank you, Colonel Larson. And now we'll move to some reactions from our other panelists. Mr. Carter, if you'd like to start.
Sure. Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming out. Good to see you again, Paul. So, just a quick story to, I guess, introduce us. So every morning I drive in from Arlington, and I drove over the Key Bridge. And usually one morning a week, I'm fortunate to pass a platoon of soldiers from Fort Myer that are out there doing PT or doing their road march. It always kind of makes me smile and also reminds me how old I am because they look like they're, teenagers, and they are. And one thing I noted on the last time I passed a group doing a road march was that 4 out of 30 had a combat patch. And it reminded me of how quickly the experience of Iraq and Afghanistan is fleeting. Yeah. That in any given platoon, in any given company unit, we now have roughly 20% of those units that have served in Iraq and Afghanistan. And in 4 to 5 years, the number will be 0 or close to it. And so we think about these wars as being significant. They certainly were. We had 2.8 million individual service members deploy, but these are going to be gone like that. And without the institutionalization of these lessons and the change of the services, we're going to lose all of this. I think the second point that you allude to that I think is really a brilliant insight is that winning armies don't learn very well. Yeah. But that begs the question, did we win or did we lose? And if we didn't do so well, according to the scorecard, what are the right lessons we ought to be taking out of these wars, and how can we tailor our solutions to them? And here's where I begin to differ with you all on the report. I think the scorecard's mixed. I wouldn't call it win or loss. I'd call it somewhere in between. But I think if we zero in on those tactical and operational issues that truly belong to the Army and not to civilian leadership, like whether we should invade or not, then I think we could probably zero in on some more narrow solutions that would fit those problems. So, case in point, active reserve balance. Does it make sense to prioritize a mission set like the manning of advisor teams, which is so critical to the effort in Iraq and Afghanistan, and give that mission to the reserve components, or should that be given to the active components? Should we have an advisor corps, if you will, for that? If you're going to leverage the civilian skills of reservists, should you in fact track those and leverage them in a meaningful way, or just expect this is going to be the stray voltage of having civilians in the reserves? As a policy matter right now, we don't meaningfully track the skill sets of reservists, let alone leverage them in any meaningful way. When we look at delayering, should we do so in a meaningful and smart way? Should we do the make or buy analysis that the private sector does with respect to all 41 of these executive agency taskings? It may make sense for the Army to run Fort Detrick and all the chemical and biological warfare stuff. It's got a ton of institutional competence there. Should the Army also be doing biometrics, or should that devolve to the intelligence community, or should it be some other agency like the FBI that does that? I don't know the answer, but the inertia of our system has prevented us from even asking these questions. And so I really want to thank you all for this, and close with one last point, which is in your class project, in your scholars project, you've done more effective strategic communications for the Army than dozens of consulting firms and senior leaders across the Army. Just to have this conversation alone is incredibly valuable public service. And so I'm really grateful for you to open this conversation about not just the Army budget and not just where we fight, but how we do it and how we build the building blocks of our Army. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Phil.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Eric Weiss. I'm thrilled to be here, actually honored to be here as part of this panel. Hopefully I can share some thoughts and some reflections that kind of combine a spectrum of tactical to strategic ideas that just kind of popped into my head as I was reading the paper. I'd like to say, as a professor at National Defense University, I'm always amazed at the level of creativity, the innovation, and the ability just to dig deep into some real large, not only social but strategic issues. As I'm reading them, I'm like, holy cow! I mean, the future of our military forces are in good hands if we continue to promote these guys and gals to more senior levels of leadership. So, what a great wicked problem to work on. And I don't know if you'd exactly say wicked, because typically those problems don't have solution sets. But considering that it's taken, we're almost on the 30th anniversary of Goldwater Nichols to actually have some kind of forcing function, a catalyst to impart a reorganization that's going to take effect for the entire military forces, that probably speaks to this is a big challenge, and people are not afraid to handle it, but sometimes it's not politically viable to address, especially with conflict or even in peace. So it seems like these issues come up cyclically on do we need a major restructuring. If you look back at the history of the military services, it usually comes right after a prolonged level of conflict. We expanded a military across the services to some large Leviathan type of force, and then right afterwards we do this massive downsizing. We end up not learning the lessons from all these past conflicts about losing all the experience, the competency sets that we grew in soldiers, NCOs, and officers as we quickly downsize and then we move forward. Unfortunately, when we look at this across what kind of challenges our nation faces for the next 20 to 50 years, our track record on predicting the next conflict is pretty abysmal. And we're even playing with the challenge now is it wide area security? Is it more of a conventional threat from some of the larger land-based armies further to the east? I don't know. But again, especially in a time of budget limitations and our poor track record, you kind of take your pick. But it is our job, whether we're inside the military or we're advising the military, to be good stewards of how this money is being used. So there is a slight danger in making assumptions on streamlining organizations or restructuring organizations that will equate to creating more efficiencies or effectiveness. I think there's a trend that way, but there is a danger unless you get into some of the nuts and bolts, and I'll talk about that in a second. There's certainly a lot of leadership literature that talks about optimal sizes of organizations, from small teams that are roughly equatable to staffs. So I think there's some support there as well. But again, we've all lived this, and those of you that have been in large organizations, or especially in the military in the past, have lived this as well. We're continually being asked to do more with less. And your section about how the Corps could take on some of those responsibilities, I agree. I think we're certainly top-heavy. But there still is that danger of overwhelming them with so many priorities that nothing becomes a priority set, at least for the missions that they face. So for my background, when you look at a problem set like this, it really kind of boils down to a nuts and bolts needs analysis. So what is exactly needed? I was really impressed with that section of your paper in terms of what's needed, who can do that job. But I think the missing component is the competencies that are required to do all those tasks. And so there's the challenge. There's the challenge that the military has had for a while in terms of talent management, right? Because our system, when we look at some of our senior leaders, we say, well, we typically do it pretty well. We've got some great senior leadership. But if you really look at how we manage that, or we look at the talent, it's not there. The system's not there. It's good enough, and so we say it's not broken, so let's not fix it. But are we really looking at the competencies that will be needed in those staffs to ensure that we're assessing the right people, selecting them, providing the training and the development? And that gets to, I guess, my last point. So there kind of is another progressive or sequential challenge on, so who gets to assess and who gets to decide? When you come up with these great recommendations, typically the mass says, well, that briefs well. On PowerPoint, it's awesome. We read it, and we're like, man, I'm all for it. The big question is, does it live well? And the challenge there is, the decision makers that get to implement this are sometimes the guys that have the most to lose and the least to gain. Right. So when you have this grassroots type of hard-hitting research or suggestions, I think that's phenomenal because of the creativity, the innovativeness, the young experience. And I think maybe that's the way it needs to happen until that resonates with the highest levels, the secretary levels, to really kind of implement that as a catalyst. It reminded me, I don't even know if I can tangentially connect this. It reminded me of this quote. It's attributed to Ben Franklin, but I'm not sure. I've never really found it in quote format. And he was talking about obviously the revolution, and he said, "A rebellion is always legal in the first person, such as our rebellion. It's only in the third person, their rebellion, that it becomes illegal." So when you have this grassroots kind of movement to say, hey, we've recognized this is the problem, here's our solution, we just need to make sure that that's resonating at the highest levels. So be happy to entertain any questions regarding those.
Thank you. So I guess I have a couple questions for the panel just to get the conversation going, and then we'll open it up because we don't have too much time left. Thanks again for all of the work that you've been doing. It's really, really been a pleasure to read through the report, and I encourage the audience to do so. Colonel McInich, you mentioned in your comments that one of the things the Army needs to do better is work better in the IIM section of the GIM environment, so with the international, interagency, multinational partners. Can you talk a little bit more about that aspect of it? And in particular, what's interesting to me is when we're talking about structural reform, especially when we're talking about gray zone competition and things like that, there's a tendency to just kind of expand. So what's the border between what the Army should be doing in the CAM environment and when that should actually be pushed more to the IIM part of the equation? And then my second question is just for the panel in general. We were talking a little bit about this earlier. As great as the work that we're doing here is, there's obviously incentives, especially when you come to talking about writing the ratio of flag officers to enlisted officers, which you do in your report. There are incentives higher up to kind of not make changes like that, yet those are the people who would need to be making the changes. So how do you actually square that circle, and what kinds of things do you think would need to take place for us to actually move forward with some of these initiatives?
Okay, that's a really good question. And luckily, we did a lot of thinking about this. So, Goldwater Nichols came about. We were forced to operate in a joint environment. And I think Paul would share my comments. I think what we've done as an operating force working in the joint environment has done very well. And as I mentioned, our research led us to believe that, that the other parts, the IIM parts, maybe not so well. There may be some cultural impediments to that. There may be some developmental impediments as well. As you look at how we build strategic leaders, the Army is still to this day very much a pyramid organization. It's up or out, and I'm not going to argue for any of those kind of personnel reforms, but it's only really in our structure for the preponderance of the force at the 06 colonel level and above, where you kind of get outside the Army pyramid, the big green Army pyramid. If you're familiar with General Colin Powell's description of in his career when he, started to interact with the rest of government, whether it be the legislative branch or other elements of the executive, or even the think tank community. And so part of it is in the development of strategic leaders. And so we looked at, are there other organizations that we could use and assign to our operating forces that allow us to bring that capability forward? Could we create or enhance what we have now in terms of special forces assistance groups to do that role for us, or to do it better, more linkage, more security cooperation, more training of others? There's an argument out there that, the cost value analysis of building partnership capacity can't be proven. Maybe rationally, in terms of a dollar and cents argument, it's really hard to say that if I gave a little bit here that it actually resulted in something. But if all of us who've done it in different environments and different areas of operation will tell you there's value added to it. I don't know if I could put a cost on it, but it helps. 17 years ago, Eric and I were in Bosnia, and I was the intelligence officer for the battalion, and he was doing some other work. And I'm pretty sure that his efforts, to help keep security and stability and train other forces were value added. But I don't know if you could have put a cost on it. That if we gave you $1 million or $3 million, it could have made a difference. But it had some efforts and progress. The second area would be like looking at personnel reform. we have foreign area officers who are experts in their field. One of our colleagues, Chris Moeller, who's in the back today over on the side there, actually wrote this section. And Chris is a foreign area officer who's got extensive experience in Latin America. So how do we take a look at his experience, his breadth of knowledge, his work, as an example, there's many more, their breadth of experience and knowledge in that environment to make the force better, smarter in the IAM environment. And there may be some personnel reforms and things we can do for experts like that. As I mentioned, we have this, this big pyramid, up or out. Keeping guys like Chris around with that level of expertise for a longer period of time than the standard Army personnel structure might be a good idea to look at, because he has a skill set that we can't just grow overnight, as an example. So, to answer your question, I think.
Yeah.
So the problem with that, I think, is, we want to feel good about some things like security force assistance or building partner capacity, and I've done it a little bit too. But at the end of the day, if we don't have outcomes, it doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. If we don't get what we pay for with Egypt, Pakistan, or any of the other countries we've given it to, then it hasn't delivered value to the taxpayer, and we can feel good about it all day long. And our defense establishment and our country broadly has a really hard time asking these questions, which I think leads to a couple of problems. One, what I'll call Pentagon-itis, or inflammation of the Pentagon, that we don't actually solve problems. We just create new little agencies to solve them. So we don't have human intelligence on the ground in Iraq. Great, let's create the HTS program. Let's not force our civil affairs community or intel community to do its job. Let's create a whole new program and throw hundreds of millions of dollars at it. Let's create all these other executive agencies. Let's not solve problems or ask hard questions. Let's just create more process and bureaucracy. That's a flawed approach. Second big problem is auditability. We don't know how much the thing costs, let alone whether it works, let alone whether we as taxpayers or as citizens get the value in the common defense we need for our dollar. And that's a problem. And so we can't even, if the next president, Trump or Clinton, were to ask, do we get value for all these security assistance dollars we spend? You couldn't even answer the question. Mm-hmm. And so we've got to ask these hard questions and answer them convincingly. Otherwise, we're going to be throwing away $500 billion a year, but maybe not orienting ourselves on the next threat.
Yeah, of course, the danger is if you don't do that, then you end up spending that and much, much more in the next time you have to deal with a crisis, right? So I did want to drill down to the question about the ratio, though, and about how there are not incentives higher up to make some of these changes. How do you actually square that circle?
Well, that's interesting because, one thing that I think that's an important question to ask, because the narrative coming out of the Army, and one reason why we wanted to focus on this report, is that when the Army talks publicly, they're talking about the Budget Control Act and sequestration. They're talking about not getting enough stuff to accomplish their missions. And our thought, again, was that some of these questions, like you just aren't asked, aren't being focused, especially publicly. Another issue that we wanted to address is that the big buzz term in the Army, or the Army's number one priority, is now readiness. Readiness is priority number one, and there is no other number one. Our concern, again, is that the Army is interpreting readiness to mean readiness in combined arms maneuver only, just in the high-end warfighting. And that has ripples across not just the defense community, but across the force itself, because it's important to determine how that's interpreted by junior leaders. Because what that means now is that combined arms maneuver is what's important. The other stuff is not. And we wanted to ensure that there should be a greater understanding that wide area security is important. And that we wanted to address this very public fight that the Army got into with itself over the past several years between specifically the reserve component of the National Guard and the active force. And to make this point that at the tactical level, the integration and the unity between the components was solid, and that there was not issues between us. We've served tactically on the ground for 15 years together, and that that the fight seemingly came out of the Pentagon and at the highest levels, and that while this proposal or this prescription, if you will, that there's proponency by componency may not be the best idea. What is the best idea? That we figure out a way to remain integrated. Everywhere you go, the reserve component, especially the National Guard, says we want to remain engaged. We want to deploy. We want to be in the fight. We want to continue to serve along the ways we have for 15 years. Please don't send us back to the 80s when we didn't have anything. And we think that it's important to address this problem similar to the way the United States Air Force did it, because they really demonstrated proficiency in that. Lastly, I would say, in response to some of that questions, is that our chapter on culture, I think, it has gotten a lot of attention because we address the Army culture, this can-do culture. I mean, it is, in many cases, our greatest strength. That if the Army is given a mission, no matter how diverse, just look at the executive agency and all the requirements we're required to do. I mean, the Army's required by the Department of Defense to be in charge of riverine operations. But the Army will step up to the plate to accomplish this. But it can also be a tremendous challenge for the Army in that we are so eager to accomplish whatever mission we're handed to that perhaps we don't provide clear policy options for policymakers, and that we don't engage in an honest conversation to ensure that we have the proper capabilities to achieve sustainable political outcomes.
Thank you. At this point, I'd like to open it up to the audience, see if the audience has any questions. We'll start back here with Tom.
Is there a mic? Oh, shoot. I wanted to yell. I have really two questions or two issues I'd like to toss back at you, but not without, prefacing it with, some snark of some sort. In particular, I'm very pleased to hear that at least somebody's making the case that wide area security, if that's the euphemism we're supposed to use, at least for the purposes of this conference, is still getting some attention. On the other hand, there's this long-running, I mean, again, this is stuff that isn't the first time this has happened. If it's that important, then how come it isn't what the active component should be doing? I mean, you can't have, the de facto, or the truth is that if the Army considers something important, it's the job of the active component. So if that's the first order mission, the most important thing that the service does, oughtn't it you ought to consider reversing the roles of the component, or the components at least to some degree, and putting that competence in the active duty force to have that, make sure you have that base covered, and we'll worry about the gunfight at a secondary level. And second issue is the whole question of destructuring or streamlining, or again, whatever euphemism you want to call. Again, experience tells us that whether it's in headquarters in Iraq and Afghanistan that are partner-run operations or coalition operations or you name it, when the reality is that we always have to expand headquarters in order to run coalitions and campaigns. And in fact, the U.S. Army is arguably the only army on the planet that can actually do this. And that we need to have the capacity, again, to manage large-scale operations, and we should build that into the structure and, again, do plug and play at the lower level as circumstances require. That's something that you can grow faster than you can grow the capacity or the competence to run, again, larger scale and multinational operations. And the prejudice across the board is get rid of generals, make the pyramids slimmer and flatter. And again, it would just seem that practical real-world experience contravenes that.
I think I can address the wide area security question. I think there's a couple reasons why the Army isn't prioritizing right now. I think first and foremost is wide area security does not require a lot of resources. And in a resource-constrained environment, especially with fiscal austerity, people, but I mean, people are cheap compared to tanks and aircraft. And certainly, I think the services advocate for additional money for equipment, wide area security is not towards the top of the list. I think another reason why that it's not as prioritized right now in the force has to do with Army culture, frankly. In that combined arms maneuver is a little more, I would have to say glamorous when you talk about watching to see what an Army does. And when the Army has to triage, right, what must we do? They'll always say, well, we can't lose a shooting war. We can lose, a wide area security mission. We can lose a counterinsurgency, but we can't lose a shooting war. But really, I know we reflect back on the past 15 years when I think we did combined arms maneuver, at least in my particular instance, for 28 days. And then we did wide area security for 15 years. So I think that's our counter argument to that as well.
Let me just add one comment, if I could. And I just learned this 2 days ago. And I think it's illustrative of the fact that it's important for everybody to do everything. And that is in both TAC East and TAC South in Afghanistan. The next two division headquarters going in are from the National Guard because we're going to use them in their ready year. And I think that's important to know because even if we go to a methodology where maybe the Compo 2 and Compo 3 units are doing wide area security, we're still going to train them and use them in their ready year. So that's important. If I could, let me just address also your comment about the headquarters. And I think it's important to understand the facts of where we are today in terms of requirements. Today, the combatant command requirement on the United States Army, writ large Department of Defense, and all the operational plans is for 5 core headquarters if we had multiple simultaneous fights. We currently have 3. Those 3 are in the process of undergoing a 20% personnel cut, which will significantly impact their operational capability, their intelligence capability, and unfortunately their logistics and maintenance capability to fight as a corps. We have 6 Army Service Component Command headquarters out in the force. Years ago, a decision was made to take the operational command posts out of each one of those headquarters. So in essence, they can't fight either, even though they're great Americans and super smart people trying to do what they have to do. So not to make it a math problem, but if you have a requirement for 5 and you have 9 that may not be able to be fully functional and fight, I think there's a mismatch. There's a problem there. The concern I have with the idea and methodology that the Army can expand headquarters as needed, and it's true, we've done it. I was on the 18th Airborne Corps staff when we went from 675 to about 1,100, and folks came in from all over the place, and we put them on the team, and we moved out, is that building and establishing and fighting ad hoc headquarters, we don't have a real good history of. And I worry as this world becomes more complex that if we look at past results as an indicator of future success, we're going to make a mistake. And that concerns me when it comes to operational level headquarters. Now, there are counter arguments to this proposal. Smart folks have said, hey, look, you're not taking a look at the history of the formation of theater armies and operational armies and all those kind of, how we did it in World War II is important to understand where we got here today. And while I appreciate the history argument, and I think it's important, I think we're at a time where looking at the past may not be helpful in terms of how we need to put Expeditionary Mission Command headquarters capable and forward that can help us fight and win at the strategic level. I think we have to do a better job of it, and that's where this argument really comes from. They would also tell you that if we have 6 Army Service Component Command headquarters and 3 corps, that we have 9 formations potentially that are capable to serve as Joint Force Land Component Command headquarters should the requirement from a combatant command exist. Well, the reality is none of them right now have the operational capacity to do so because we're cutting personnel out of an operational command post. So we get back into that ad hoc issue. They'd also argue, well, if we have a 2-corps fight somewhere, and there's plans that exist where we have 2 corps side by side, similar to Desert Shield and Desert Storm in '91, and in 2003 we had 2 corps side by side. One was Army, one was Marine, going to Baghdad. You wouldn't have a land component headquarters capable to deal with them. The counter to that is, well, if you're worried about a 2-corps fight and you only have 3 and you just took 20% out of the headquarters, the math doesn't add up there either. So why not, in our proposal, make 6 that are fully functioning and capable and have capability? And we've learned since the wars that you have to have 3 to make 1. So why not have 6 to make 2, if that's the concern? So I think there's a lot of validity to the thought process. There's a lot of headquarters restructuring that would have to go on, and that makes folks nervous, understandably. So, thanks.
At the strategic level, you can do labor hoarding, but you can't do labor hoarding and then augmentation. So the problem is not, you nailed it. You can't have all these ASCCs and then on top of that build standing operational core headquarters, and on top of that have your headquarters in the field. And that's what we've done with MNFI and ISAF headquarters and everything else. So, you have to use the force structure you build and do what was done earlier in the conflicts, where you take 18th Airborne Corps and then you use that in the field as your standing operational headquarters. The second point, I think, we talk about people versus hardware and which costs more. Yeah. And I think the data is pretty clear that people are really costly. Yeah. While you were talking, I Googled the unit cost of an M1 tank. Unit cost of a service member is roughly $400,000 a year, all in, fully burdened. Unit cost of an M1, $8.5 million in today's dollars. So you buy a new M1 every 4 years of tank crew. And we don't think about that. We don't think about how expensive our people are. You gentlemen on the stage represent the collective investment of tens of millions of dollars over the course of your careers. We have to think smarter about that in ways we're not doing it all now.
Other questions? Right here in the middle. If you just wait for the mic to come.
Hi, thank you for being here. I just wanted to ask if you all would comment on how the Army is or should be responding to what many would call an over-reliance on special forces to address conflicts around the globe, sort of this concept that policymakers can have their cake and eat it too. They can use special forces as a silver bullet to address conflicts without having to make what could be considered politically risky decisions.
I'll take one piece of that pie. I think when I was an enlisted guy in Special Forces, and when I went through the training in the 90s, our focus was on a couple things: unconventional warfare and foreign internal defense. And largely, what the Special Forces did abroad was train and build partner capacity. And I think our over-reliance on Special Forces in that particular capacity is addressed in our report, in that we think that this train, advise, assist mission advisory core is probably a good idea if we have to do it. And again, of course, like Phil said, it has to be linked to sustainable outcomes. But that the conventional force, in our opinion, especially the breadth and depth of a brigade combat team or a battalion, properly structured, is perfectly suited for that mission. What we advocate for is what we call accordion missions, or accordion units, or skeleton units that are primarily officers and non-commissioned officers, those that can teach. And if you think about what NCOs do anyways, I mean, primarily they teach. They're soldiers. They lead, but they teach. And I think they're really suited to do this mission along the wide spectrum of different warfighting functions. So not just maneuver, but the incorporation of fires, mission command, medevac, and all of the different sustainment, intelligence, all of those things. And we believe that in order to do that mission, that alleviates special forces of having to bear the brunt of that completely, and that can be transferred to conventional forces.
Yeah, I would just add to that it's a really important question, and especially if you look outside of the direct action kind of mission that SOF increasingly are kind of known for, especially in the press and around town and things like that. I think you'd find that actually they're not as well resourced as you might think when it comes to things like military information support operations and also regional language skills and things like that. These are things that, and there have been studies that have been done on this that have been categorically underinvested in over the past 10 to 20 years. And I think those are really some opportunities that the larger Army could look at as well, simply because a lot of these types of missions, as I think they're alluding to at their train and assist section in their report, could actually use a much wider application than just smaller teams can provide. So I think there's room for improvement even there, and especially if, and the paper addresses gray zone issues. I won't get into all of that right now, but there's definitely a role to be played there. I think too, if you look at like kind of how the Army is being used in AFRICOM, that's kind of an interesting case study, right? Where they're doing some of the things that you would think that a special forces would have done in the past. But on the whole, I think they're having success, but at the same time, like the roles are not really all that clearly delineated, right? And I think that's something that we should look toward in the future. Here in the back, I think we have time for maybe two more.
Good morning. Chris Muller. I'm part of the group with Paul and Kevin. I just wanted to add a little bit more from my perspective as a foreign area officer. And my last assignment, I served in the Dominican Republic as a senior defense official. So I was the recipient of special forces in a building partner capacity role. Forces would deploy into the Dominican Republic to help train local security forces. And I've also worked with them in Colombia in years past. Just a quick vignette to kind of put into perspective and to tie into building partner capacity. The special forces, with their regionalization and language training, are a tremendous asset, much more than a conventional force when they come to a country, because they oftentimes have everybody that speaks to some level the target language, and they have that experience, most of the time folks on the team that have been in that country before, which makes it much easier to accomplish that mission. And that's why we see a huge success in Colombia. Interestingly, the 7th Special Forces Group that worked in Colombia for years and years did a tremendous job during Plan Colombia. After the war kicked off, and other Special Forces Group went over to the sandbox, so to speak, and got involved in direct action, or CAM, as we would say, the 7th Special Forces Group wanted to get into that fight as well. And we lost the 7th Special Forces Group in Latin America for about a 2-year period when you include the deployment and train-up. We saw when other Special Forces Groups came in, equally as well trained, but not culturally astute, not linguistically prepared, we didn't get that same bang for the buck. But interestingly, in the culture, in special forces, infantry, wherever you are, the fight is where you need to go. If you want to get promoted, you want to have success, that's what is in our mindset. However, now that the war has drawn down, special forces are more available, we've got more forces available to do training. Now, I will personally say that, in Chris's opinion, the 3 things that have not gotten cut along with everything else in the last few years, to the same extent, Special Forces, Intelligence, and the National Guard Bureau. Those 3 entities seem to have a little bit more to work with than the conventional forces. So I've been offered many times additional Special Forces asset that I don't think were necessary, and we turned them off. But with that said, pound for pound, it's a great investment when you have that matching group training in their corresponding region. And that's what we covered in the paper a bit, this idea of developing a security force assistance group, a conventional force like a special forces group that's regionally trained in the language and the culture, senior NCOs and mid-grade officers, captains and majors that would be regionally aligned. So they would be in a operational unit for an assignment, then they would go to this group and work in a specific part of the world, and then go back to the conventional side to maintain their tactical skills and operational skills, and then go back and work in that same region. And just one other a quick addition to the building partner capacity, the state partnership program is probably one of the smartest things DOD's done in the last 10 years or so, aligning a state National Guard organization with a country. Because once again, you see that habitual relationship. I served in Afghanistan in a Polish sector. The Poles have a state partnership with Illinois. Why? Because there's a lot of Polish Americans that live in Illinois, Chicago area. During that deployment, the Polish task force had 15 American National Guard soldiers, from colonel to about captain, integrated in the Polish task force staff. So when the higher multinational command was reaching down to the Polish task force, embedded within it was several Americans that have worked with the Poles on many occasions before. And you just saw a much better operational success because of that long-term relationship. Thanks.
So I'll pile on just a little bit more. I don't even know if we need it. We're kind of killing a dead horse here. I had a lot of privilege to work in special operations community at the tactical and then on an operational staff level. And what it boils down to for me, at least this question, is tools in the toolbox. It gives special ability for additional options and capabilities that can be used at the strategic level for limited engagement. These organizations tend to be smaller, a little bit more selective. They've got a better talent management aspect. So it gives you a larger breadth of capabilities to apply to limited scenarios, so that you don't have to get the big Army Leviathan engaged, deployed, and executed. So to me, I mean, that's a very valuable piece that we have. I think at least military on the whole does it a little bit better with the assets that they have compared to the Army's limited roles, but certainly tools in the toolbox.
One more quick question over here, and then we'll wrap up.
Thank you. I was commissioned in '69, and then I grew my beard when the Army kicked me out in '97. What I've been listening to is like, if you're old enough like me, it's deja vu all over again. But one of the questions I'd like to ask you guys, the current guys, is I remember back when I was on active duty and then a reservist, that if you weren't in the big Army, the combat arms, if you were fast, foreign area specialist, or in special forces, that was just something you passed through, because if you're career-oriented, you didn't want to be there forever. And I wondered, is it changed? I mean, I never thought that a former P at school, English P at school, would become chairman of the Joint Chiefs. I just shook my head when that happened. And I wonder, has the culture changed to where the big Army combat arms no longer has the big hammer on promotions and career progression?
I'll let you guys tell you. I get in trouble if I talked a little bit more about talent management.
I mean, I think we talk a little bit in our culture section about the Army's most senior leaders coming almost primarily just from the combat arms, specifically the infantry and armor branches, and certainly that where these generals come from influences promotions, influence the directions that the Army is going in, and may, which is directly probably responsible for us, really specializing more in combined arms maneuver. In terms of changes along the past, I'm not exactly sure, but I do know that that the Army's been fairly decent on broadening relationships and opportunities and assignments. I taught at West Point. Kevin did as well, and I think they try to put us in different places, whether it's institutional, academic, or strategic along the way, so to help develop us.
Paul, I can give a little bit of specifics to that one question. For foreign area specialists and a few other specialties, about 8 or 9 years ago, the Army came to the conclusion that instead of keeping us mainstream with the conventional forces, where I'm an engineer officer, and in years past and in your time, sir, an engineer officer would spend time, say, as a major in a battalion. He'd go off and get some language training, a grad degree, go work in a country for a couple years, and then he'd go back to an engineer brigade, potentially battalion command, and then go back and forth. What the Army realized is you can't become an expert in a region bouncing back and forth. So they decided to do what was called career field designation. So when officers get promoted to the rank of major, they basically decide, okay, Paul Larson's an infantry officer. He's going to stay as an operational infantry officer, and he will continue his career on that side. Chris Muller's an engineer. He's now going to become a foreign area officer. So I spend the rest of my time doing foreign area officer jobs. When it comes to promotion, I compete against other foreign area officers. I don't compete against Paul because back in the day, we would be competing against each other. Well, who's going to get promoted? The guy who's been in infantry units his whole time, or the guy that's been off in an embassy for 3 years, you know, and the board doesn't necessarily know what they're doing. So I think the Army's made the first step in realizing that, hey, we need to have these guys specialized. The challenge is that once you get out of the operational force, if you spend too much time out of it, sometimes you become irrelevant. In my case, they grabbed me out of Chile a couple years ago and said, hey, boom, we're sending you to Afghanistan. You're going to be in command of a MIT team over there. And that helped regreen me and kind of keep me relevant. So it's a constant struggle, but we have changed the way we're managing some of our specialties.
Let me just add two points briefly, if I could. I'm an intelligence officer, and I knew when I was commissioned as an intelligence officer I'd probably never be a 4-star and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So it's kind of knowledge. And quite honestly, from my perspective, you know, the Army is about the synchronization and integration of combat arms to do bad things to bad people. I quite honestly want our senior leaders to have grown up in that environment and understand the application of military force to meet national objectives. I think there's a lot of goodness in that. The second thing I would offer is I literally just flew in last night from out in Kansas, where I was in the brigade pre-command course, where all the guys who've been selected for brigade command get to go. And so I'm sitting in a room with a bunch of my peers. There's 34 of us in the room. I think the common perception might be that of those 34, maybe 20 or brigade combat team commanders, hard meat eater guys going out to the force to do big hard bad things on behalf of the Army. But the reality was it was only 4. So we have to take a perspective on, and this is a course that's run 6 or 7 times a year. We try to get about 200 folks through it, and this is the pool that become the general officers. And so 4 of 34 are in that realm. And so what you've got to consider is all the other things the Army does and the Army enterprise that's worldwide and writ large, that's much bigger than our 30 brigade combat team. So though those 2 points kind of contradict themselves, hopefully it provides some perspective a little bit to answer your question. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming out today and for staying a little bit later so we could get in some questions. I believe that we'll probably stick around a little bit afterwards if you'd like to ask any of the panelists a question. And thank you so much. Round of applause for our panelists. Thank you.